Alexandra Pringle, and I'm a book publisher from London. And this is my 4th LLF, so I'm very excited to be here, but I think I'm squeaking. Is that better? I am really thrilled to be talking with Osman today. I read his book last week. It's only just come out in Britain, and it was a revelation to me. It's one of the most moving and extraordinary memoirs I have ever read for many, many different reasons. But it's not just me. Am I okay? It's not just me that thinks that. Just a few days ago, Stephen Fry said, "I read it with such pleasure, terror, amusement, admiration, and fascination. It is surely one of the great childhood memoirs of our time." And Hanif Kureishi said, "A poetic and moving book, Osman paints pictures with words, unfolding hidden stories that stay with you beyond the final page." Osman is a man of many, many parts. It is extraordinary because, as you can see, he's very young, but he has done an enormous amount in his life already, so I can't imagine what's going to come next. He was born in Birmingham to immigrant parents, and we will be talking about that because it's the subject of his book. Both his parents were illiterate, and neither of them could speak. He grew up in the poorest working class area in Birmingham in England, and he went on to go to the School of Oriental and African Studies to do a degree. I believe doing a PhD at the Royal College of Art. So that just gives you a kind of idea. But meanwhile, he is an extraordinary clothing designer, world famous. He's dressed no fewer than 120 Hollywood stars and numerous Bollywood stars. And the stars include Beyoncé and Lady Gaga and Emma Watson, and I could go on forever. But he is an interdisciplinary artist who is at the moment creating some very extraordinary sculptures at the Royal College. So welcome, Osman. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for being here. It's really my first LLF. Can you hear me? No? Okay, maybe I need to probably push this a little bit closer to me.
Yeah. So to begin, so this is a memoir of his boyhood, and what Osman has done in this book is that he's taken you by your hand and taken you into this world which is to so many people a completely unknown world, a very closed world, and it is in its scope, it's like reading a novel by Charles Dickens. It's almost as if you are in the 19th century, but we are in Birmingham in the 1980s. It's filled with stories. And the thing about Osman is that he takes us between different worlds all the time. And I want to explore those worlds as we talk about his life. And that is the worlds between women and men. As a little boy, he could go between the two. But between literacy and illiteracy and education, between brown and white, between the frontier of Pakistan and Afghanistan and Birmingham in England. So there are so many different things that are explored in this very, very rich book. But I'd like, if you could begin by telling us a bit about your parents and where they came from.
So my parents come from, you guys probably know, from in the KP, from near Topi Sawabi in the Tarbela region. And then they migrated to the UK. My dad came in the late 60s to the UK, and my mum followed him about sort of 8-9 years later in the 70s. And then my older brother was born here, and the rest of us, like 4 children, were born in the UK. So it's really a story of a working class kind of conversation where people who don't necessarily, these weren't the doctors or the nurses that came to build the kind of the NHS. These were the workers who came to do the jobs that no one really wanted to do. They worked in the factories, in the foundries. So it's a real kind of, it's a story of how they really kind of coped, because they couldn't really speak the language, they couldn't really communicate with anyone. So they created a microcosm for themselves, basically, which was so distinct. It's like the Amish living in a different kind of world, basically. So it's this kind of contrast of worlds where you have this kind of white secular world, you have a very Muslim identity world, you have a group of people who have come over, you know, they've come over in the 60s, their wives come much later. The identity of Pakistan only is beginning to kind of form. So they have these kind of regional identities, and they seem to be one set of people is better than the next set of people. So they kind of compete this idea of what Islam is, what it isn't Islam. So it's a kind of very layered way. I mean, and when you put that right into like the equivalent of living in a Hira Mandi type sort of environment, so you live in the poorest environment, which is it's a red light district area. So on the poorest areas is where all the immigrants live, and all the prostitutes actually also work as well. So you have these women who are very parda nashin, so they arrive in the 70s, they're in full kind of like burqa, and then they create a world inside the home in contrast to the world that they are allowed to actually engage in outside. So you have these women on the streets who are workers. They're not really allowed to go to the shops to actually kind of do their own shopping. So it's this real kind of world. I hope that's kind of like set the scene for you guys.
So as this little boy going out into the streets and seeing the incredible painted prostitutes, there was one you thought was really beautiful, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was actually one who was called Jamila, who was actually an Asian prostitute, looked like an Asian prostitute. So in a kind of quite a culture which is super conservative, and the background that we kind of come from, the idea of seeing someone who represents a sex worker who happens to be, who also looks Asian, is sort of, I mean, we see it in films. I suppose we see it in like kind of the ideas of courtesans, but that seems a very elevated way of what a tawaif is, basically. But I think this is kind of like very dirty, down on the street. So it's a different kind of, it's a very working class and kind of underclass as well, because there's a working class concept, but then there's those who don't necessarily fit into that working class concept, because there's an underclass. Because you're racialized labor, you come and actually do the work that no one really wants to do. So you kind of like sit below.
And your father lost his work, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you become, so my dad actually, so they came and they couldn't read or write, so they did the works, what's in the heavy work in the foundries. But then you had this transition in the 80s, which was the loss of industry. So like in Pakistan, we still have we make things. So in the UK, it was still like, in the 80s, it was like kind of this transition that they had. So all the factories started kind of closing down. We had this what's called the deindustrialization of the North. So you had this, when labor came over, they were working in the textile mills. I mean, our history with the subcontinent and textiles and colonialism is another kind of conversation. But these were these kind of like the heavy industries and the shipbuilding and the rest of all of those that started closing down. And then these are what these people were really kind of good for. It's the same way that you see now, actually, there's a lot of the labor that goes out to the Middle East that works in on those construction sites, the equivalents of all that kind of world, basically. So you have this these people who couldn't necessarily do anything when they shut all the factories down. So, and that became...
And one of the things was that your father was not working, and the mosque was the male world that he was in, wasn't it? That was very important.
I think the mosque became so important, and I think that's this, and for me it's been this idea of, I've been always trying to think about when my parents, and they were all this very, like, they look really kind of like movie stars, they're very dapper. There's these kind of photos of them in the 60s where they're kind of very, they look like kind of film stars in a weird way in their black and white suits. And then the transition happens in the 80s when they start losing their jobs. And it's really how do you maintain an identity? So it was like really, the mosques became really important to them, and religion became very important to them,
But there is this other world, which is the world of women, and until you were, was it 12 years old, you could Osman could slip between the worlds of men and the world of women, and his mother was a seamstress, which is obviously a very important thing in your life. But tell us a little bit about that world that your mother was in, behind the curtain, literally.
So yeah, I mean, it's, so my mother had a dressmaking business. It's not a kind of, it's not a tailoring business. She was making salwar kameezes for a lot of the women in the community. And, you know, that also helped us actually, you know, feed our family. But what it did was, for me, it just opened up a world, because when you have this kind of, in our little house, we still had the area where the women could only go and the men would actually be able to only go in one part of the house. Any guest that came lived in another, or sort of visited us in the front room, and the back rooms and the drawing room were actually all where the women kind of inhabited their spaces. And it's very, you know, it's, I think we still have, I'm still trying to explore that. I mean, when I go back to the extended family back in KP, they still have very similar setups where the women and the men don't necessarily meet together, I mean, apart from unless you're family. So it was this kind of world, and I, as a kid, until I hit puberty and grew up, you're allowed to walk from one place to another place. So the book for me is really that crux where I could record everything as a kid who has this past that can go from one space to another space. And that's really this kind of, I think that's where the root of the book is really for me.
You're a great observer, and you describe loving stories as a little boy and books. How old were you when you got engaged with the thing of narratives and of stories? Was it very early on? I think it was.
I mean, you know, can you imagine, basically, if you have you're seen as kind of like, TV is seen as being evil, like, you know, like all of these things that come into, I can remember going to the mosque once and the imam saying that now there used to be like the voice of a kanjari, like a voice of a prostitute coming from everyone's house when the radio was invented. But now there is a full sort of set of there's a physical element with the television. You can see it physically. It's just not it's just not radio. So this kind of idea that these TV boxes were kind of seen as boxes of evil that came in and actually transmuted a different world to you, where the devil would dance naked, was actually it's how I kind of grew up, basically. So the TV was, my dad would watch it for wrestling, cowboy films, kind of acceptable type of like genres to be able to kind of like to consume, but anything which was kind of a little bit different, or a world which was like, the white world was actually seen as very evil, and we were good Muslims, and our world was really about sort of preparing for the akhirah, the hereafter, and how you really just are preparing. This life is ephemeral, and everything around it. So you kind of like have this world of like, you create a community with many people who think the same. So they all come from one area, they transplant themselves, they don't necessarily have a way of being able to integrate with the rest of everyone else. So they look very, very inward. So you create a closed world, which is so tight and so close. It's like, you don't really, you want to take advantage of what's around you, like any economic betterment of like being able to work, and you want your children to, well, the boys, I mean, the girls weren't allowed to kind of integrate at all. The boys are allowed to go in and out, so there's a gender privilege. They're allowed to go in and out, but you're trying to like keep a tight rein because you see this world as so alien to you.
But the situation of women is very, for me, it was a real eye-opener. It reminded me, when I read this book, it reminded me of reading Khaled Hosseini's A Thousand Splendid Suns, in this really humane and tender portrait of women's lives. But there is so much sadness there in the book, as well as love and joy. There's a moment when a mother can't run to see her child who's been knocked down because she's not allowed out, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I wasn't there, but this is a recounted story. So the women weren't allowed to go outside of the thresholds, outside of the front door. So when they, because, it's quite a crazy concept. If your child is outside, they're playing on the street, and they've been run over, and it's the men that actually go and control the situation, and the woman is looking from afar from the door, and she can't comfort her child, basically, or go there. It's this kind of real... So those are the kind of like barriers that you weren't really allowed to kind of cross, and it was kind of quite normal. I also still remember that my mum still remembered me, goes, well, kind of at least my husband's not as strict, and my dad was really strict. Like, she said she went to see someone in the hospital, and they couldn't even take their face, their burqa, kind of like their front covering off, basically, and they're sitting in this room of ward of women who, so she's actually there to get treatment, but somehow she still has to create a space that no one else can penetrate outside of her space, or the curtains in the ward. So it's this kind of real, I mean, it's the kind of root of patriarchy. The older I get, it's kind of, for me, it's very much about control.
And there's a lot of violence, not just in the community, but in your home. There's violence, isn't there?
Yeah, I loved my dad. My dad's quite a complicated person. He's, but if he didn't get his way, then a shove and a punch and a push didn't really. It was another language, basically, a language of control. And it just seemed something which was kind of normal for me, basically, to be able to see that you had to control people. And, the older he got, the softer he got, the more kind of like, his daughters weren't allowed to go to school. So after the age of 12, in the UK, where education is free, they were, at 11, they weren't allowed to go to school. So they're kept home back in Parda. But my nieces from my older brother, my dad died about 3 years ago, but then they were allowed to. So it just seemed like over a period of time that this sort of generational sacrifice. So he came to do one thing to actually to get a better life for themselves in another country, and in a country which is kind of like super alien, where you don't really know how to operate in that world, and you can only control, and you can't control everything else around you, but you can only control your family and your family environment, basically. And that sort of is then again the next person does the same thing, and the next person does the same thing, who are from the same community. So you create this microcosm where all of those rules are the same rules for females, for young children, for men themselves. And they started very much taking on this kind of very Muslim identity. There's nothing wrong with a Muslim identity, but it was just for me, it was just this kind of navigating this this generational. So you come in your 20s or your 30s, you look like something else. Then you lose. You transition into another identity, basically, because whether it's economic, the lack of actually, you lose your kind of identity because you don't have a job anymore. So you start taking on like a different, I mean, for me, I've worked in fashion. So it's always about sort of what sort of conversation that you want to have in the outside world. And if you look at some of the mullabazi that we have that stems from in our country and a lot of the Muslim countries, and I think religion is quite an interesting concept. It can give you a lot of like comfort and purpose, but then it can also give you a lot of control on the other side. So, but you have this huge element of control in the name of religion, and a lot of that actually, and I think it's also this idea of the Deobandi thoughts of schools of thoughts, this wave of like everything is like shirk or bid'ah, the coloring of Islam that we kind of had in this country, where many things are like shrine worship. A lot of those kind of conversations become like this, like they're seen as Hindu customs. They're seen as customs that we shouldn't be doing, because as Muslims, this is not actually our history. This is not really our culture, but we're not Arab. Sorry.
Both you and a sister had to have a rift with your family in order to be who you wanted to become. Maybe talk a little bit about that and how that went.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's about how I had to leave to actually become who I am, and I don't know what I've become anyway, but it's like this kind of idea of, I think being a creative person is kind of like, was quite at odds in that rigid kind of world. So like I grew up saying that you shouldn't draw, you shouldn't actually make anything that is animate. So anything that actually is animate, on the day of judgment, God will ask you to put life in this person, in this drawing, and they will actually tell you. So somehow this reckoning with you and God in the hereafter of anything that you've drawn, and you will have to. So for me, it was like, not that I'm saying that drawing actually is like my main preoccupation, but it was this idea of like these so many gates of control that you had to kind of like pass across. So I needed to move away to be able to have my own identity, and my sister kind of like, my sister did the same as well.
And got herself educated.
Yeah, I mean, my sisters have done really well. One actually left. She left. She put herself through university herself. Then my other sister's like a doctorate. She's doing on honor-based violence. So they kind of like the formal education of what's called high school was kind of taken away from them. But then after one of them ran away, Another one, when she got married, just to save the honor, her husband did let her actually go out and go to school, even if he was kind of abusive on other levels. So it just became an idea for them to kind of find their own paths as well.
And even your older brother, he had to marry somebody to keep the honor of the family when he had actually fallen in love with the local girl, hadn't he?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, I think there's a kind of whole cliche, it just seems like a Bollywood film to some extent, where you have these cliches, but I think once you start putting this, when you have a very strong patriarch, and the patriarch makes all those decisions for you, what they think is right and wrong. And sometimes, sometimes they are right in some extent. I look back on my life now and I think sometimes I should have listened to my dad on certain things, and may have bought a house earlier and done certain things in a way which probably would have actually given me more kind of like security. But I think, but then I'm not really naturally a kind of wealth accumulating person. And so it's this kind of, I don't know, I think it's this kind of, for me the book is really about a series of journeys of many different people.
Yeah. And why did you decide to write the book?
I mean, why did I want to recite the book? Because I think for the women, really, more than anything else, there were the stories of the women that no one really would have recorded, because they weren't going to be, so I think the working class story doesn't necessarily get recorded so often. The working class story, it may be great in a kind of like a novel in a way, but I mean, I was trying to sort of whether turn this into a novel or a fiction or a non-fiction work. And it was the idea that I kind of had to accept that it was non-fiction, even though memory is very different. So at the age of what you remember at 10, and then what you remember at 20, or what you remember at 30 or 40, and how you try and understand those memories at a particular time, it softens and blurs or amplifies those kind of experiences. So for me, the book was really about trying to record these histories of these women that no one was going to record. So for me, it's also an anthropological document.
Yeah. My feeling is that this is a book that will be read, it will have a very, very long life, because a bit like there's a book called Mayhew's London, which is a record of people's lives, working class people's lives in London in the 19th century, and it is an essential part of British culture. And I feel that what Osman has created is a book like that it's a record of a time and a place which nobody has written before. And the detail of it, just as in Mayhew's London, is extraordinary, your recall. But also in this book, I'm being bugged by a fly. You do it all from the point of view, you do it very well from the point of view of the little boy. Was that what you set out to do?
Well, I didn't want to judge, and I think kids don't judge, basically. And that was a real kind of balance of actually, I didn't want it to be, guys, this is it's not a misery memoir for me. It's a very observational piece of work where you just kind of like, you see domestic violence, you see great food, you see something that you're attracted to. Kids do that. They just jump from one thing to another thing. And I think that it took me a while to kind of find that sort of space, but that's really how I was kind of comfortable in. Even though I got sort of like a lot of push to create the arc from my kind of editors and publishers, I would have felt much more comfortable. I mean, 90% of the book is really from the eyes of a boy, but then I had to give way in some ways.
It's all right, you just dip in.
Pardon?
You dip in
Yeah.
from now. But what, of course, is so interesting is that children accept the world that they're in. And I think that it is so different. When we're adults, we forget that children are extraordinarily resilient, and they live in their moment, and they accept what's around them. And I think that you capture that very well. So you don't judge, and also the world that you recreate has so many, although there are all the conflicts, there are these very, very strong bonds of love. And you feel Osman's love for his father, and very much so for your mother as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that, but also you have to understand when you, okay, you guys you live in Pakistan, you have an extended culture, a much wider culture, but when I was growing up in England, my culture became much smaller, and it became very much about religion and religiosity. So when as a young kid, I came to Pakistan, I saw these people like dancing and going to weddings and doing different things, which was, when I grew up, I saw them as actually, I was told it was all wrong, because it was like, you're messing with hellfire. This is not really the kind of world that, so you have this like what a culture becomes closed, and because you don't have an extended family, because there's only you, there's no uncle, there's no khala, there's no one else, so your family and your world becomes much kind of smaller, and everyone else's worlds become much smaller, and you don't benefit from this extended culture that I kind of experienced as a kid. So when I came here as like a 10-year-old, 7, 8, 9-year-old kid, basically, there was the kind of real expanded, the kind of the joy of shadis, the joy of weddings, the joy of different kind of like celebrations, which we, as a migrant, you kind of try and recreate, but then you have this idea of the mullah religiosity coming through, which becomes like this. It becomes like a kind of, for me, it becomes like an incubation in another. You're transplanted from one color, and you're somehow trying to cleanse your culture of any non-Islamic, non-religious identity. So it becomes less richer.
And you came and lived in Pakistan for 6 or 7 months. Yeah. So maybe talk about that, how that was when you arrived.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a village. It was kind of like there was no running water. The water came out of the well. So these kind of like stories where kind of, it seems quite fantastical. All the houses were all inside out. There was no windows facing outside. It was just courtyard houses. So it was just this kind of contrast of what I saw in the UK to what I saw here. So that became this kind of real fantastical story of like, I saw a snake, I saw sort of certain things. So it's this kind of real idea of this wonderment as a kid, really.
And how easy did you find it to go back into your life in Birmingham after that experience?
Well, then, we came in the winter, and then the mosquitoes came out, and then we couldn't bear, so we left. We went back to England. So, yeah, it was this kind of, I think if you're a kid who's actually an observer, who thinks, and who kind of like tries to make sense out of things, but then has this kind of very sense of recall, it just kind of added another layer for me of storytelling. It was just like another set of people who just kind of like came in, and I knew, now I saw my mum's mother, and I saw that connection, that body, where that other body came from, and then how I connected. So these kind of bonds became kind of bigger, and then how, this idea of this extended family, and in a country where, there's also now as I'm older, there's how much an extended family means so much, has so much value here in Pakistan in comparison to a secular world like the UK, where you're just seen as actually a small family, basically a nuclear family, and you're not so confined by what someone else will say or what someone else will do. So this kind of, but then you have these ideas, you have the NHS, you have free healthcare, you have free education. So you're kind of on this road of secular conversation, or like a less kind of more about me as opposed to a wider conversation, where in a country where you don't necessarily have institutions that will support you, or you don't have like free healthcare or free education. So you have to rely on a larger extended family network for many things.
And maybe I'd love you to talk a little bit about Britain at that time in your childhood and the racism that was part of all your lives, everyone's lives. I think it was a particular period.
Yeah, I mean, this is the 80s where you are, it's super racist. Like, you know, you are completely, you have the skinheads who are what's called the skinheads and the National Front. They'll do a weekly march and they'll go into areas to say, you know, Paki's out. They'll I mean, it's very interesting now that I think it's the ideology that the middle classes ideology that that mobilizes the working class against another working class because of race. So you have like people like, you know, I mean, Enoch Powell was many like decades before, but then you have like, you know, these working class kind of leaders or kind of like, you know, who may have read sort of racist ideologies, which are probably very much kind of like trying to solve problems in the world, basically, where, you know, whether it's like Mein Kampf or it's this whole kind of idea, and I've just really kind of realized now is like you mobilize a set of the same people, the same working class people against another set of working class people just because of race. And there were weekly marches. My uncle got really badly beaten up that he never left his house again. It was this kind of real world of contrasts where you'd come in, you're trying to make your new life, you're trying to get economic betterment, but you have these forces and these hostile environments who are coming in and who actually say that you're not necessarily welcome here, you're not really here, even though, you know, the pavements of the UK and this colonial power were actually built from, you know, this subcontinental lands. So it's this kind of real, you know, that you don't have a right to be there. And so that's a kind of another interesting juxtaposition.
And of course, you write very well about the different gangs, the skinheads, there were also Rastafarians, there was the whole, you know, that culture.
I mean, the kids, my older siblings and some of the elder uncles, they weren't going to take anything lying down, so they created their own gangs. So they had their gangs called the Lynx, the Panthers, and they started out as a reaction to the white supremacist kind of movements. So, and these kids were, you know, they were going to defend their spaces, basically. So they'd come, sometimes they'd actually break the windows of a lot of the Asian shops. So they'd actually do night patrols, and the police wouldn't necessarily do anything. So it was this kind of real, how do you're looking inwards, but then you also have to protect yourself as well.
I just want to see if anybody has a question to ask. I have more if they don't. Yes. Sorry, could we maybe have the microphone? It's difficult to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, how difficult was it to publish your first book? Because it's very difficult getting a publisher, because they, you know, when you're first time you need an agent.
Yeah.
And
I don't know, I feel really bad. It was kind of quite straightforward, but I think it is bad. It is, I mean, I have a kind of profile already, basically.
That makes a huge difference.
Which makes a huge difference, and
yes.
I apologize for that for some reason.
But it's through your work that you had the profile. So it's not as if it fell into your lap. You worked very hard. And of course that makes it, speaking as a publisher, it makes it easier as a publisher to publish a book. And, you know, it's a tough world. Like, it really is hard.
I mean, I'd worked with all these celebrities, and I think everyone was expecting that it was going to be this fashion celebrity memoir, and I think that's probably they got a bit of a surprise when they got the final script.
But it's had the most wonderful reviews,
Yeah.
absolutely fantastic reviews, understanding what it is that you've done, and well, as I've said, I think it's a classic book, and those come along very rarely. Does anyone else have a question?
It took me 6 months, over about 3 years.
It's hard labor though, isn't it?
It is, as I kind of, yeah. I think at one stage I just had to kind of like, there you go, I can't look at this again. And every time I'm a bit of a tinkerer, so it's very difficult for me to let go. And at some stages it just needs to be like locked down each chapter, and I couldn't really touch it. And it kind of like, there was a very strict, yeah, I think and it takes and I've realized it takes a long time to actually publish books, because it goes through many, many different stages, and the kind of processing, and then the marketing, and then the release dates.
It's a year really from delivery of manuscript to publication, if you're going to do it properly. You can't cut corners. It's a very long process. It's the opposite of journalism, which has to be very fast and very reactive. Any other
Are you writing
questions?
something? Oh, wow.
Quite similar. It's actually, I was born in UK as well.
Oh, wow.
And when I was a kid, I used to be called chocolate face and onion face. And my dad was a doctor in
Wow.
UK. I mean, I had a pretty liberated kind of background. But, you know, it's just like in UK, there's institutionalized racism, which you can't beat. I mean, like, suppose if you go as a doctor, you have jobs after every 6 months. Don't give
Yeah.
permanent jobs to, you know, colored doctors.
Yeah.
And I had a very traumatic life myself. I changed 20 schools just
Oh my
because my
God.
parents were moving all the time. So I never felt settled in Britain. So I came back to Britain in 2006 because I wanted my kids to have a stable life, you know. I mean, although I went to Edinburgh University myself, and I had a very good job over there as a government, but then again, you know, you're always institutionalized, you know, it's a very difficult country to live in when you're called chocolate face, and you're discriminated against all the time. So, you know.
No, I mean, I think at that time it was very kind of in your face. But I think what's really interesting is how that racism has actually turned to what's called nationalism. So you can be racist now, but hide behind a sense of nationalism. And being British is actually one kind of like, you can be racist now by calling yourself like kind of British. You can't call anyone a Paki, but you can actually somehow hide behind this identity of everything I'm doing is because I'm proud to be British, or our borders are actually safe, and these kind of like conversations where you're not really properly British because you don't necessarily integrate, or those kind of conversations, or Muslims are a certain type of migrant which is never going to fit into a Western way of thinking. So it's quite interesting in a way that how that, you know, you can't be openly racist anymore, but you can be openly nationalist, and it's just the same thing, but in a different word to me.
That's really interesting. And how would you describe your identity, or do you prefer not to?
I don't know. I mean, I'm, you know, I'm British. My parents are from Pakistan. They created a life, and I'm lucky. I have a British passport, and I can go many places in a way, and that's the luck of my birth, not necessarily the luck of my class. And I mean, for me, I don't know. I mean, some things, like I have a cousin who's in Malta who works on a construction site. He's always like telling me, Osman, can you get me a visa to get to the UK? And I've tried to help him get a visa to get to the UK, but it's been rejected. And then it's this kind of real, like forever, the guilt that I have of, like, you know, my parents, siblings, children who have a different life to my life, and I kind of like this sort of diasporic bond that I have, that I still feel kind of somehow responsible for the choices my parents made, and I still have to help them somehow.
And just finally, I'm very interested in the question of languages in people's lives and how languages get lost through generations. My grandparents, their first language was Arabic, and it got lost in my mother's generation. And so for you growing up in that way, what was your language as a boy? What's your language now? What do you think in? What do you dream in?
So my mother's family speaks all Pashto, my dad's family speaks all Hinko, but they kind of like, so we had this kind of real mix of worlds, and then they didn't speak any English, so we had our own language amongst our kids, which was like the code English language, anything that we didn't want to actually, our parents to know, we spoke in English. And then, you know, it's this kind of real, you know, all of those languages. And then we went to Sunday and Saturday school on top of going to mosque every day to learn Urdu. And so it's this kind of like real world. So I think, you know, my Pashto isn't good enough, my Hindko isn't good enough, my Urdu isn't good enough, and I can just about kind of write something and read something in English. So.
Your English is pretty good. I think probably we need to wrap up now, is that right?
Any more questions? Anyone else? No?
So I'd just like to say here is this book. I really, really recommend it. It is astonishing. It's a book that I shall keep with me in my heart forever, I think, and go into this world, and it's an extraordinary thing that Osman has created. So thank you, and thank you for talking to us today.
No. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And good luck. I hope you guys write something beautiful as well.